Before the success stories, the progress, there was you. You who made a choice to grow, to inspire, to overcome your own challenges. At NASM, we're in service of your limitless potential because when you keep growing, we all get stronger, and we'll never stop making your journey our mission. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified personal trainer.
You're listening to the Peak Physique Podcast with Andre Adams on the NASM Podcast Network.
Hey guys, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, NASM Master Trainer and IFBB Physique Olympian athlete. Today, we've got a really exciting topic I've been wanting to share for quite some time, and it's everything you need to know about muscle protein synthesis. I think this is a concept that not a lot of people fully understand, and it's actually a lot more complex than it might sound. So we're going to dive right in. Let's start by defining what is muscle protein synthesis and why is it even important for bodybuilding or physique outcomes. So as you might have guessed, right, muscle protein synthesis involves the process of building muscle tissue, right? So repairing and recovering muscle tissue. It is the opposite of muscle protein breakdown. And you'll see these oftentimes abbreviated as MPS for muscle protein synthesis or MPB for muscle protein breakdown. And with muscle protein breakdown, think of that as a term that is defining being catabolic, right? So being in a catabolic state where you are breaking down proteins and amino acids in the muscles. Now, we're going to go really deep into this concept in a bit here and talk about what things can help drive both muscle protein breakdown versus muscle protein synthesis. But MPS, muscle protein synthesis, is the process of building muscle protein, growing muscle tissue in which amino acids are synthesized into skeletal muscle. That's going to be actin and myosin. This occurs through a very complex process of signaling pathways, which then converts mRNA or messenger RNA that basically takes packets of instructions from the DNA and converts it into specific proteins, right? We would call that synthesis. Now, in short, like MPS, muscle protein synthesis means that your body is anabolic. And anytime that MPS is greater than MPB or muscle protein breakdown, there is net anabolism to maximize the amount of skeletal muscle. As you might have guessed, right, in the sport of bodybuilding, physique outcomes, we want to build as much muscle as we can, but we also want to repair and recover as fast as we can. So this is a very important concept to master, whether it's training for yourself or you're coaching other athletes, or just general clients that are looking to improve their body composition. Now that we've defined what muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown are, let's talk about what variables really most significantly impact muscle protein synthesis. Now, there's quite a few on here, so I'm going to just go through some of the top ones that stand out to me when I think about it. You know, the amount of skeletal muscle mass can directly impact the amount of protein synthesis that's happening inside the body. The diet and food type, right? So nutrition timing and nutrition type. We're going to define what factors can affect the impact on muscle protein synthesis through nutrition. And then one that a lot of textbooks or, you know, people that are maybe unfamiliar with the sport of bodybuilding or unfamiliar with TRT and things like this, we need to be thinking about also the impact that PEDs or AAS, anabolic androgenic steroids, and even peptides like IGF-1 or growth hormone and these types of things, what impact do they have on a physique athlete when we're talking about muscle protein synthesis? Because this will directly affect how you approach the programming. So nutritional strategies, recovery time, training intensities, volumes, right? All of these things are directly impacted by the ability to repair muscle tissue. Another really important variable that is one of the most significant ones in terms of MPS is going to be just good old-fashioned resistance exercise, right? So your You're working out with weights, you're applying this external stimuli to the muscles, and this in turn triggers a different signaling where it's going to make your body a bit more sensitive and release higher amounts of muscle protein synthesis compared to just diet alone. Right? Everyone's heard about the anabolic window. We'll further define what they're really trying to discuss, right, when they're talking about the anabolic window as it relates to resistance exercise and muscle protein synthesis. One thing to point out too, when we're talking about those variables, is when you combine resistance exercise plus nutrition together, they have a higher MPS impact than just nutrition alone. If you did, let's say, just focusing on diet, you've got a sedentary individual, or, we're not putting any kind of stimulus on the muscle, and you were to consume some protein, after about 1.5 hours plus or minus, that muscle protein synthesis process is going to actually turn itself off. It's going to shut down. And there can still be bioavailable amino acids in the body. You can still have, different types of signaling happening within the muscle. But when it's just diet alone without the stimuli of that resistance exercise, after around 1.5, 2 hours, muscle protein synthesis tends to taper off. However, when you combine that with resistance exercise, you can maximize this for many, many, many hours after this. So very important concept to remember there. And then also upregulation of, the muscle protein synthesis process due to all of those things that we just discussed: nutrition timing, the nutrition type, the resistance exercise, potentially if there's AAS or PEDs involved. All of these things can upregulate the entire process, allowing your body to recover and repair faster and also grow, new skeletal muscle tissue. Another thing that we should be conscious of when we're talking about nutritional programming is, and this applies to training too, if you're in a fasted state, is the absence of glycogen/glucose, right? This can increase cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, obviously, but it's also going to cause your body to break down more muscle, right? It's also going to cause your body to hold on to some inflammation, maybe some extracellular water or body fat around the abdominals primarily. So in the absence of glycogen and glucose, this variable can directly impact your MPS to MPB ratio, right? And that's via gluconeogenesis signaling. So we need to be conscious of that when we're talking about nutritional timing. We've got the proteins that we're focusing on today, but we also need to be conscious of the glycogen and the glucose that's in the body. Guys, if you're just joining us, this is the Peak Physique Podcast, and I'm breaking down everything you need to know about muscle protein synthesis as it relates to physique outcomes and the sport of bodybuilding. One thing that I'm excited to share with you guys today, if you follow me on Instagram, you probably saw a few stories and reels that I shared recently, breaking down a case example of the different types of proteins and then also the different volumes of proteins and how they impacted the muscle protein synthesis process in some recent studies that have been done. And I found this fascinating, so fascinating that I had to share it with you guys here today. So I'm just going to kick off this case example and give you guys my thoughts and takeaways from this. Now, the question initially was, does 90 grams of beef increase muscle protein synthesis more than 30 grams of beef? So let's just assume it's, some 90-10 lean beef. If you eat 90 grams, so let's say 3 30-gram patties versus 30 grams, is that going to have a higher bearing on your muscle protein synthesis and your ability to build muscle? Now, this question was initially posed by, somebody I actually follow on Instagram, always putting out good content too, Bill Campbell, PhD, and it cited a study that was, I'll give you guys the number too, this research paper, if you want to check it out. It's PMID 1969988. Highly encourage you to Google it, look it up, and do a little additional research on it. But in this study with the 90 grams versus 30 grams of beef, and which has the higher MPS, a lot of people guessed that the 90 would automatically by default have a higher MPS. I actually posted this on my stories and did a poll, and shockingly, my following mostly predicted that 30 grams would have a higher MPS. Now, the correct answer is that according to the study, that they are the same, right? They both assimilate at the same rate. They're both 90-10 beef, and they're ultimately going to have a very similar, and what was measured was a very similar total impact on MPS. Now, there's one issue that we'll say, and just for reference to that study showed about a 50% increase in MPS after consuming the 30 grams, with the other group also experiencing a 50% increase in MPS after consuming 90 grams. Now, the two big limitations that I seen right away was really that the timing didn't make sense, right? So they only surveyed it for a maximum of 5 hours. That's, variable number one, we'll call it, that's going to directly impact the outcome. And variable number two is it was not recorded after resistance training stimulus. Remember, we just talked about what are the most significant variables that impact MPS. Well, there's two of them right here, right? And they also did not delineate were all participants in this group experienced athletes, sedentary individuals, was anyone on any kind of hormone replacement therapies that could, again, affect the MPS. So just a few more things that could be added to it, right, to make this study a bit more robust. Now, newer study, there's another research paper. If you want to reference, it's PMID 38118410. It compared 100 grams of milk protein and the increase on MPS, which was about 30% greater than 25 grams of milk protein after resistance exercise. Now, we've got a similar scenario. We're taking the same type of protein, just different volume. So 100 grams of milk protein versus 25 grams of milk protein post-workout. Now, the reason that happens is, again, because of this stimulus of resistance exercise, we're aware that there's different signaling that happens. This is that anabolic window we talked about, right? And it induces a greater stimulus of muscle protein synthesis response than just diet alone. So this is why you're seeing that uptick in muscle protein synthesis due to a higher volume of the protein post-workout. So this is a really important concept for you guys to understand and apply when we're talking about nutritional timing. We're talking about nutritional strategies, and then also, weaving that into your training, your resistance training protocol. Now, the other important thing to note about this newer study is that it was measured over a 12-hour period, which showed not only a higher peak muscle protein synthesis, but it also had post-resistance exercise, also had a longer and more sustained curve. So because of the higher sensitivity post-workout, you get a higher peak with a higher amount of protein, and then it's able to sustain that. And then, you get a total, if you look at the area under the curve, you're going to get a much, much greater total MPS over that 12-hour period of time. Now, had the study only been conducted over 5 hours like the first test, you might have a different outcome. So this is why it's important to understand how time can also affect things like muscle protein breakdown and muscle protein synthesis. One variable that's still missing, again, is with and without the use of any kind of hormones, peptide signaling, IGF-1, other things that could directly impact MPS. These are things that I find fascinating. So I'm hoping that maybe these types of studies will become more common and lay the groundwork for future studies that answer more of these questions or go a little bit deeper. That being said, from a nutritional standpoint, the types of protein will change the peak and the duration of total muscle protein synthesis. This is something I actually learned at First Form many, many years ago when we start talking about, let's take a, standard whey meal replacement protein versus a hydrolyzed whey isolate protein. And we can do this post-workout just for consistency here. If you take a meal replacement whey protein that sustains you for, let's say, 2.5 to 3 hours versus a fast assimilating protein such as a hydrolyzed whey isolate, that whey isolate post-workout is going to have a much greater MPS, right? Now, that muscle protein synthesis is going to spike or peak a little bit faster, but it's also going to taper off a little bit faster versus a very slow assimilation where you get this peak after, 2 to 3 hours and it starts to taper off. So you've got different types of proteins that might be utilized or implemented at different times of the day, depending on what the goal for that particular meal is. And then you've also got, this is kind of logical if you think through it, you've also got mixed proteins, right, that are complex, where you've got maybe some plant-based, you've got some whey, and maybe there's some isolate or some caseinate, right? So you've got these different timings within one protein that can help maybe get you some of those amino acids and start that protein synthesis, get you that spike, but also sustain you for a longer period of time as well. And you'll see different things like this, similar with carbohydrate complexes as well. So that's really the driving force behind it. Now, if you look at the curve of muscle protein synthesis, let's just compare 90% lean beef versus hydrolyzed whey isolate. This is actually would be a good side-by-side graph for us to make. The whey isolate, again, is going to peak much higher, but drop off faster, whereas the beef is going to have a slower assimilation, a lower peak, but it's going to have a much longer sustained window. The net muscle protein synthesis, that's going to be the total incremental area under that glucose curve. So that's oftentimes abbreviated as IAUC, and it's based on glycemic response to food. So this is, again, another good measure of how much impact this nutrition or post-workout is having on muscle protein synthesis. Now, some of my key takeaways that I'll leave you guys with today, that muscle protein synthesis should really be measured over a longer period of time when assessing, unless you're looking for a very specific outcome or variable in that shorter time frame. So remember what we discussed earlier, right? If it's just diet or nutrition alone, after roughly 1.5 to 2 hours, if it's just nutrition, your body's going to have a tendency to start shutting down muscle protein synthesis as that food assimilates, despite having some bioavailable amino acids in the body and different signaling happening within the muscles. When you pair that with resistance exercise, you have a higher degree of sensitivity, and you're going to be able to get a much higher protein synthesis spike, right? So this is where your body's going to be able to metabolize and use more protein, and you have the option to, make that a complex protein source if needed, depending on what the particular goal is for that meal. Before bed, this is actually a great time to implement some of those very slow digesting proteins. And there's a few other tricks that you can add to that if you are a fast oxidizer like myself and you tend to burn through nutrients in food very quickly. Before bed, you can load yourself up with a larger portion of protein, maybe shift some of your daily macros towards that last meal of the day. Go with a slower digesting whole food source such as beef, maybe it's salmon. You can further slow that down by shifting some of your healthy fats and pairing them with that slower digesting protein. And then again, if you need to further sustain yourself, you can do things like berberine, right? GDA, something that's going to the assimilation rate of the food, and also slow down that glucose spike as well if you're pairing that with a carb. Strategies before to take away with you. Any other time of day, if we're talking about a meal replacement, we're talking about a protein source that's appropriate for breakfast or any other time of day, I like to just stick with normal whole food sources, right? So that's going to be things like your normal lean proteins, fish, maybe it's chicken, could be turkey breast. If you're a vegan or vegetarian, you're going to have those plant-based sources. But, you want a more traditional, something that's kind of in the middle in terms of assimilation for that any time of day protein. And some of the most impactful things that you can do in regards to muscle protein synthesis is going to be monitoring and tracking your total daily protein intake, right? If you can give yourself that goal, you're working with a nutritionist or you're doing this on your own, right? If you're self-coach, calculate out of your macros, what percentage of those macros need to be protein, take that total volume of protein, divide it evenly throughout the day, spread it out over, let's say, 4 to 6 meals. And that way you've got every 2.5 to 3 hours, you've got this, this food source coming in, and you're going to spike that protein synthesis. And by the time your body starts to reach that catabolic state where you're going into muscle protein breakdown, it's time to eat again. So that's probably the most impactful thing, is just total amount of protein, evenly spaced and distributed throughout the day. Another key takeaway would be understanding the effects of androgenic anabolic steroids, PEDs, and other types of peptides and hormones that can upregulate the MPS system due to signaling and anabolic pathways. And that anabolic window, that's the last thing I want to drive home with you guys, is make sure you're not missing an anabolic window. It sounds so cliche, and I think, it's maybe been overused over the years or maybe misunderstood over the years. But that anabolic window following a very intense resistance exercise training session, that's going to be your best friend when you guys are trying to optimize skeletal muscle mass. You want to get that repair and recovery process started right away. That's your golden ticket to building muscle. Guys, that's all I have for you today. If you guys are enjoying this content, definitely make sure to follow and subscribe to the NASM Peak Physique Podcast. You guys can always find me online on Instagram. It's at @AndreAdams_official. You can also email me questions or topics you'd like me to cover in subsequent episodes at trainingbydre@gmail.com. And of course, for any coaching inquiries or additional questions, you can reach me online at andreadamsofficial.com. Guys, thanks again for joining into another exciting episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. I can't wait to see you guys next time.